Hello and welcome to Healing Tips from the Heart, Intuition with Helpers, Healers, and Guides. I am your host, Dr. Lori Hops, licensed psychologist, writer, and artist. I've explored mind, body, and spirit related to intuition, or your personal guidance system, since early childhood. Meet my guests who have learned from their personal and professional lives to explore vast realms of knowing, synchronicities, and overcoming challenges. Their stories may inspire you with tools to enhance your daily living and relationships. Hello, everyone, and welcome my special guest today, Mandi Freger. She is a licensed professional counselor in Pennsylvania in the United States of America, and she is also a behavioral specialist. She holds a master's degree in educational psychology and a diplomate in comprehensive energy psychology, which is the organization ACEP that I know her from. We've known each other for many years. She also has basic training in integrative and functional medicine through the Institute for Functional Medicine, and she is a group fitness instructor for cycling, Zumba, and yoga, amongst other things. And I'm so glad to have you here, Mandi, with me. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I was just telling you a little bit before we got on that I was really looking forward to this week because you do know me a little bit, and you're a psychologist, you know ASD, you know energy psychology. So this will be a nice in-depth kind of interview, I think, too, today. So
yeah, great. Well, why don't we start off by finding out what is ASD, because you mentioned that right out of the gate.
yeah, ASD, autism spectrum disorder. And you may have heard of autism or Asperger's or pervasive developmental disorder through the years, but the new updated clinical appropriate term is autism spectrum disorder. So a lot of different people with different skill sets all fall under this umbrella now. And then there's more, of course, clinical criteria to be able to determine where that person is and what their needs are.
Okay, and so for those who don't know anything, maybe you can give us a snapshot, like introduce Johnny he was diagnosed at age 3 or, something like that. So we kind of have an idea.
I want to preface the whole conversation with ASD by saying the famous one-liner. If you know one person with, it used to be autism, you know one person with autism. So this is a very neurodiverse subpopulation within ASD. So most of the people that I've worked with, are very different, but what makes the criteria similar is they all have differences in either socialization. There's difficulties and challenges there with communication and behaviors. And when I'm saying behaviors, stereotypically, some people might think that, oh, there's bad or maladaptive behaviors, but these can be troublesome behaviors that maybe you don't notice as a member of the community or public. They can be more internal, or they're maybe a little bit more subtle, that are problematic to a person's daily functioning. And they can be sensory driven type behaviors where a person might be extra sensitive to the environment or things around them, are undersensitive, which can cause a lot of difficulties and challenges.
Okay, so it sounds like for those who are not so familiar, that we're definitely talking about something that's interactional, that's how you interact with the environment, how you process sensory information, also communication with others, and how your behavior fits in or doesn't fit in, maybe to social norms or expectations. Is that kind of a fair way of saying it?
Yeah, and when I usually explain this or do basic trainings about it, I say, if you think about problems with communication, problems with behavior, and problems with socialization, that just affects everything that we do. So this is a diagnosis, issue, disorder, however you want to phrase it, that really does affect people in every life domain all of the time. And again, there are different different strengths and different skills that each person has. For example, everybody doesn't have that, crazy good memory that might be a stereotype of the disorder, and not everybody might, flop their hands.
Okay.
Again, it may not be overtly obvious to a person, whether they have the disorder or not. And, there can be some behaviors that just maybe feel odd or awkward that you might be receiving from a person diagnosed. So I think the good thing about all the awareness going on, that we're, really trying to educate people about this, is that might be a person out there's first thought or next thought when they are coming in contact with somebody that might be challenging for them, or, maybe what we call triggering, that, hey, this person might have something, a difference, neurologically, neurocognitively, that I just am not aware of. And perhaps that's why they're acting this way.
Okay. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. An example from maybe everyday life, which is not a comparison, but just to get a sense, is when we're in a radically different environment than we're used to.
Mhm.
So, for example, I lived abroad part-time for a couple of years, and the culture shock was just, even though I was prepared for it, it gets into you in a different sort of way, and you start to think of yourself differently and see yourself differently and wonder why you're missing certain cues and not getting others, and can't
Yes.
communicate things. And or if you're around a different culture, for example, I was around some people who were doing craft work with their hands, but they were visually impaired. And so I had to think so differently about how I was communicating, because they asked me to kind of read the instructions for how to crochet a pattern to them that they could then record and use later. And boy, was I not prepared for that, because when you read it through, it's different from when you speak it. Because you
Mhm.
can't say, and now repeat the last 27 things I said. Like that would just, you need a separate script. So I think what I'm talking about is becoming aware of things that we take for granted.
Mhm.
And also the things that are hidden within, that are gifts, that may be unusual gifts, but they're things that are unique and maybe underappreciated about people in all communities. So I know I just threw a bunch of stuff out at you, but maybe there's something here that is a through line that we can pick up on.
Yeah, the first thing that you mentioned about being in a foreign country, I have a book coming out which I'll talk about a little bit later. But in the book, I talk about one of my mentors early on, and his name was Dr. Ralph Wilps, and he was a psychologist, and he really was passionate about just being out in the community and training families. This is 20, 25 years ago,
Mhm.
about ASD, and he had what he called the phases of autism at the time, and really what that what that training, what that explanation was about, was to help parents understand, as your child starts to develop skills, this is what the progression might look like. And they were practical examples. I'm going to skip over the first two, but the last one he called A Foreigner in a Foreign Land.
Yeah.
And that's exactly how he talked about it. It's like, you kind of can read some of the cues maybe, but you don't know the language. You can kind of piece things together, but you still really have to be a little bit more aware and attuned to get by,
Mhm.
but you blend it,
Got
if
it.
you're walking down the street. So that was interesting that you described it as the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. I worked for many years doing psychological testing for people with learning differences, including people on spectrum. And I remember we had some support groups for parents through children and adults with ADD. And one of the things that was so helpful was this kind of story, the parable of, you thought you were going to France, but you wound up in Germany, or something like that. And it's like you prepared for one trip, and the food and the language and the climate and all of this. And then like the airport, the plane somehow diverts you to this other place where you land, and you're kind of shocked. Like you still are on an adventure, or you're still traveling, or you're still in process of change, but it's not what you were expecting. And this is a really good way of describing what happens with parents when they are first confronted with more information about their child, maybe than they were expecting.
Mm.
Different information. And that doesn't have to be with ASD, that can be with chronic illness, it can be with all kinds of things, orientations towards life, thinking patterns, differences. in our personalities and all of that. So yeah.
Just a different path.
Yeah.
Just going down a different path. Yeah, one of the things that I know that you talk about a lot that I wanted to maybe bring up today was being heart-centered in the
Yes.
work that we do. And I wanted to tell a story. I've never told this story before, but one of my first experiences, I never thought I was going to be a therapist.
Okay.
This was not what I thought was going to happen, but like if we just listen and go with it, it happened. But I had a cousin who worked, she was a special education teacher, and she worked in Special Olympics. She did them every year. She's like, oh, you should come, it's fun, it's great. And her daughter also was a participant in Special Olympics, and she was my age. So I remember going and not knowing what to expect at all. My mom was a teacher, but I wasn't as familiar with special education because back in those days, the kids were in a different room, they were in a different area. We really didn't have a lot of contact. And I was just a kid at the time too. And I was like, I don't know what to do. I was in hindsight thinking, I don't know how to maybe communicate with these kids. I'm not sure how to relate, if they can understand me. So she was so great and outgoing at her job. She was like, come on, we're going. And and she got there and I watched her for 5 or 10 minutes. Man, like this, she's got this confidence, never changed her language, right? She was just speaking to all the kids, and they were young kids too, right? You think you would talk to kids with a little bit of a, all right, but nope, it was just how it was. We're going here, get ready, you're over here, you can do this. And I remember thinking, yeah, that's it. And when I think about how I've applied that to my job, it's really been an action-oriented, heart-centered approach. And I don't want to say non-judgmental, but everybody's on the same playing field as far as coaching, challenge, and motivation, really, and the skill level, of course, varies, but in my mind, that's unwavering. And for me, that's what I used to like to teach my staff, that you might assume or think that coming from the heart means feeling bad or over empathizing with somebody or giving or perhaps enabling, but there's a little bit of a different way to look at it, and it can be action based.
I like that. I like that. Yeah. I'm thinking about the heart as being a container. So we think of the heart as a connector, with empathy, with love, with distaste or rejection, or grief, the ending of the connection or a phase of separation. But it's also a container. And I think that in your example with the Special Olympics, that there was an assumption of, here is the safe container, here is the domain that we're going to work in. Here's where you're going to stand, here's what you're going to do, here's the timing of it. And so there was a clear vision. And then the participants were able to then be themselves within that. And that is part of, we think of it kind of maybe a structure, but it is part of a balanced heart connection. So I like that part of your story, and it doesn't assume difficulty. Yeah, it's like
I like how you said that. That would be helpful to also think about when we think about the best teaching methods sometimes for younger kids who are diagnosed with ASD, heart as container. I talk about executive functioning a lot when I'm trying to explain to maybe parents about how their kids are thinking about things, because quite often I see that there's a patterned formulary way that each individual thinks. They're not going to be the same for everybody, but if I can just master your formula, this causes this, and when this doesn't happen, then this doesn't happen. Where's the answer, kind of thing. And when I talk about those formulas, like I try to emphasize that there's a need for structure, and we can sort of close that gap with a yes or no for the formula, and sometimes it's a TBD, but panning out a little bit bigger into the way that I think a lot of people are comfortable learning. And even us, even on I call everybody who's not formally diagnosed a non-spectrum spectrumer, because we're on a continuum, right? So that structure, when people see high structure, when I used to work at the school and come in and see this, they used to say, oh, isn't that cold or not coming from the heart? And I'm like, this is that what you're talking about, this contained heart-centered action that, they're secure in and can
Yes.
thrive.
Right. And it's not cold. It's not rigid. And it's actually kind. I think what happens a lot is that people tend to either undergive or overgive or
Mm.
do both. And then the container is weak in both of those cases. If your container isn't flexible, it's actually weak. It might look strong and sturdy, but it can easily be dismantled when it needs to be flexible. And then if your container isn't strong enough, then it's boundaryless. And that's when you get into problems. So anyway, that's just kind of general good psychological functioning. But I think that when we're with people who somehow seem different than us, we think that we have to throw out kind of everything and then get lost. Like, how am I supposed to be? I don't know. What should I expect from this? I found when I traveled that it helped when I communicated my confusion. And people were so generous in helping me because then that took away that self-responsibility or self-criticism of I feel lost. And this can happen in the space of all kinds of cultural differences that we find ourselves in, historic and ethnic and religious and so on. And it's owning your own limitation and then, but saying, I'm willing to connect and to try to find a way through this. So anyway, yeah, thanks for sharing that story that you had.
Yeah, it's so important, the communication and the clarification. I'm seeing this a lot with younger people, that they're either afraid to ask or don't understand, and then they sort of freeze. This is
Yeah.
just in general. And so I think that's a great message to ask. I'm not sure I understand, or can you say that again? Can you say it a different way? Did I hear you say that? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Just practical ways. And
Right.
on the other side of communication and not sort of wavering who you are, I like how you said that also. I found that the individuals that I work with in my private practice, the more quickly I speak, and the more assertive I am, and just really am not guiding the conversation, it actually helps them lift up their communication skills also.
Oh, okay.
So back in the day, when kids are little, they say, oh, in schools they always wanted to pair them with a mentor of a child so they could model what they were supposed to look like and be
Yeah.
doing communication wise. So I do think that that's helped. I don't really do it intentionally. It's sort of just my default that that's who and how I am. But I have noticed through the years that some progress with that, just I think because, I could overprompt. I could do a
Right.
lot of to help pull things out. But when I hold my ground, again, it's teaching them a different skill set too.
It's a different energy flow. So when you're learning a foreign language, it's like this, like ba 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 ba, and no one speaks like that. But that's good to slow the brain down and get the learning in. But if you never progress from that, then that's how you're going to talk.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you're not going to have that natural flow. And if someone is already challenged in terms of picking up naturally the cues of timing and flow and pace and reciprocity, if you're only giving them one flavor of that, that's what they're going to memorize and use. And then it's going to have them come across in a stilted way. So I can see why when you get to a certain skill level, it's good to kind of almost have like an immersion, in those other dynamics. So I wanted to switch it up a little bit and say, how do you combine this with energy practices? Because that's a really unique niche that you have that I wasn't aware of existing. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about what energy practices are for people who don't know. And then if you can weave them together, I think that would be really helpful for people.
Yeah, energy psychology to me, it's an umbrella of a lot of different mind body techniques. I'll keep it short like that because we could go into a lot of different jargon about it. But to me, so I learned energy psychology techniques first. And what that meant for me was, let's tune into the body and feel what we feel wherever. And if there's something that's not right, doesn't feel great, let's work on the emotional component to that. We don't necessarily need to know what the emotional component is, but let's try to work on emotional regulation that might help resolve the tension, whatever your word for it is, in the body. So that was my understanding of energy psychology in a nutshell in practice. When I started to work with ASD, this was like, we gotta just behavior, behavior, behavior. And what I found is there is actually a natural overlap and sort of an integration of both, because the better that you get at being a behaviorist, which is really a part of it, is really observing people's behaviors, observing their cues, observing their patterns, a lot of observation. But the more that you do that and the more that you learn one person, it almost becomes predictable, right?
Predictable.
But
And so you were
we
saying,
observe behavior,
Mhm.
the more tuned in we get to subtle cues, and the better that we get, just say observing one person, right? We start to see every move, and it almost becomes predictable because we are patterned as humans somewhat. And I'm talking about like every day for hours a day watching the same person, which we did in a center-based facility or in community-based work that I did. So it it develops a confidence that you almost know what's coming next. So I always talk about their formulas, but it patterns us as behaviorists when you get really good at it to, to stay in a neutral place, but to use science and the predictability of, hey, I've seen this happen every time this happens, this is likely what's going to happen again. And then you start to be more confident with that type of skill. When you hinge on that type of skill, that if I have enough information and I can see a pattern happening again and again, then to me, it starts to interface with intuition because you're confident in saying, yes, this is the right thing. And then if something is saying, wait a minute, maybe not, it sort of might be a cue, behaviorally or otherwise, that we might change direction.
Can
Like
you
the
give an
person.
example?
Right. So I'm thinking of a student I worked with in the center, and they sort of had the way that they would transition, physically transition, like to get up to move, might be a couple sort of rocks before
Okay.
they actually move.
Okay.
And as a behaviorist, right, I watch those rocks and it's like 2 to 3 rocks, maybe 4 sometimes, and then there's a move. So the one time I see it, there's 2, 3 rocks, and then we just stop. Uh-oh. So I'm tapping into my science mind that this doesn't fit my formula, but then I start to think, what's happening? Is there going to be something different? And then your intuition says, uh-oh, or it's okay, because there's another move or a lack of a move that helps you get to the next place. So all of this action over the long haul starts to let your brain sort of release any emotional attachment to an outcome, which can facilitate other intuitive messages, if you will. So, right.
So,
So this kid,
yeah, go
so
ahead.
what I would have done is normally I would just wait until, he walked. So I just chose to take an action just to move just a tiny bit closer, just in case. And so you can make different choices with that. The other thing about how the intuition, I think, starts to influence is confidence and tentativeness and reading other people's feelings.
Mm.
So if you're in that neutral state, let's go back to my behaviorist example of this person. I'm in a neutral state. I'm prepared with tools should this go a different direction, either a good direction or a not so good. I'm confident with my tools. I have the tools, but I see a different direction. Even though for the sake of this show, I just said, uh-oh, my emotional brain doesn't go into fight mode. It just says, uh-oh, in the fact that next steps, what's your next line of decision making? And then I can act. That really helps keep the neutral mind intact
Okay.
rather than the emotional mind. And again, it's sort of effortless, it's flow, and you made a good decision. For somebody who's not a behaviorist, that looks like, I've heard people say, you're psychic. How do you see that? It's really
Oh,
cues that
okay.
I do attribute to 2 things I'm talking about. One, that it attributes to this, again, you see the cues, the subtle cues, and you're able to act maybe more quickly or in a way that someone else might not have seen. And then 2, the confidence of staying in that sort of quiet mind and not having an emotional charge for a long periods of time actually help to stop the chatter, to be able to use any types of impressions or next line of thinking way more efficiently, which I think is sort of borders on intuition.
Oh, great. Okay, this is different than I thought you were going to say, so I'm really interested to kind of look at this a little bit more carefully. So if I heard you right, speaking of communication skills, it sounds like you're talking about regulating yourself as an observer to be able to be as neutral and open as possible, while at the same time anticipating changes in behavior from the person you're watching. And
Yes.
and so you already have skills for how to regulate yourself. Because
Mhm.
here's the scenario I saw: parent, child. The child gives a cue that they are distraught, but they aren't really saying it, but they're doing a buildup. It's like the windup is happening. And
Yep.
the parent starts to get tense because
Mhm.
on some level they're anticipating an explosion, a problem, a conflict, a meltdown. And they're like, every time my kid, let's say, scratches his ear or starts to turn his head a little or takes a deep breath or starts to hum a certain song, I know he's about to lose it. And so when I see him do that, I'm already amping up my energy in
Yes.
defense mode to try to like
Yes.
stall it, change it, respond, react.
Mhm.
And so that's what I thought you were going to go with it. And how do you help the parents stay more neutral and grounded so that they can have a smoother negotiation with
Yeah.
the child? And so what you gave was a beautiful example of how someone who's trained to observe a child or a person can use their intuition and their own calming down skills to stay with and anticipate these subtle differences.
Mhm.
So
And there's
anyway,
yeah, that's great. And that's right. Well, your example is where we start, and that's where I want to finish. And this might be a good time to talk about some of the material that I have in the book, because a lot of that is,
yeah.
and I came up with what's called 7 caregiver types. And they range from the example you just gave to what I just gave. And I start with describing each type as a frame of mind. And the the one that I think, I'm just going to pull out one for an example, because we were talking about, coming from the heart in a way that most people might think, just I'm going to love you and give you a cookie and that's going to fix everything. I call that the sweet grandmother type. And on this chart, I talk about the 3 components that are necessary to be a really good caregiver with this population. This really can apply to different populations. But the first trait that we look at with some of these types is, where is this person's skill level? And if we're talking about ASD in this examples that we're talking about, we're looking at applied behavior analysis. How well am I reading cues? Do I have the tools to know what to do if this or that happens? Do I have my reinforcement toolbox with me? All of that good stuff. So skill is the first one. In this sweet grandmother example, we don't have too many of those tools.
Mhm.
You know? The second marker would be the willingness to do this type of action or this work, or to be in this position. And this sweet grandmother type is the one who has, gosh darn it, all the will in the world. I want to just hug this person and make it all better. So this is, again, the stereotypical, this is my heart. I just want to love you and give you a kiss and it'll be great. So some people, and this is an interesting sort of progression over time too, when parents first find out about the diagnosis or when they start into this work, they might have be going through the grieving process on some level at this
Yes.
point, maybe not. And that's, of course, in different times and throughout the life. But the willingness might start out as either like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't want to. It's a lot. It's overwhelming, to this get or done attitude. And
Mhm.
then it can wax and wane, right? I'm
Mhm.
exhausted. I can't do this anymore. I want to do it. It feels bad. I feel bad. This is my child. I should want to, but I just honestly don't feel like doing this. So willingness is a second identifier there. And the third one I call biofilled strength. And this is a combination, again, with biofill, right? With getting research on this now. It can be a lot of different things, but for the sake of this text, I define it as how resilient we are and our confidence, and how that emanates. You and I both know how that emanates through our energy. And I always give the examples that, if we're standing in someone else's field, that, there's a symbiosis there, and we're either taken on or given unintentionally. So those 3 factors, for the grandmother, not so much skill, high will, and
Yeah.
I think I'm ready to do this. But what can happen in any one of these caregiver types is one of these things can sort of start to blow out, or two at the same time, before we get the other two strengthened or one, right? So my field, I want to do this, I want to do this, but what happens emotionally? I'm going to give this child a cookie, but he won't stop crying. What else can I give you? What I can give you a hug. I don't know what to do. I did everything that I could, and I still can't get you to feel better.
Mm-hmm.
That's resilience, willingness. I still kind of want to, and I still don't have the tools. So one can be left emotionally drained
Yeah.
at this type. So I go through a lot of different types. Ultimately, we want that last type, what I'm talking about. We want someone who has a really good skill set. And I talk about the skills needed in the book. I talk a lot about this behavior strategies I'm talking about here. The willingness, and I want to do it, and the field strength. And this is the self-care aspect in the book. And
Yes.
this is where the energy psychology comes in
Okay.
and build that resilience. I found for parents, one of the reasons, I don't know if you know this about me either, I left the autism center to go into private practice. My license, actually, I came home from an ACEP conference and there was my license in the mail. So when I went into private practice, I thought I really need to focus on ASD and caregivers, because throughout my career, managed care organizations especially were really like, oh, these kids aren't appropriate for outpatient. If they don't have communication skills, what can they process all of that? And I'm like, there's a really underserved need here, especially when we hit 21 and there's not a whole lot of options. So I remember talking to one of the big insurance company reps, and she said, we have 3 providers in all of the Pittsburgh region, 3 licensed to be able to do any type of behavior modification. So I was like, we need to do this. So when I started to work with parents, what I found was the parents that were coming to me have tried a lot behaviorally, a lot, and consistently. I'm talking years. This isn't, I'm trying it for 30 days and that didn't work. And they were truly exhausted. So the parents that have found me had really high skill sets. The willingness was wavering just because they were tired.
Yeah.
And their biofield's confidence were just really shot. The exercises that I would give them were the foundational ones that we talk about in the certification program from ACEP. One is the collarbone breathing from Dr. Callahan. If people aren't familiar with that, you can look it up on YouTube. It's a great couple-minute breathing exercise. It's a little bit integrated. Some people find it a little bit tedious, but in 25 years, I think that's a lot of bang for its buck pretty quickly. And the over energy correction, which is pretzel crooks hook up, called a lot of different things. So I like to just start people with those pretty quickly, because again, the progression of having a tool that is perceived to help or work is really powerful in itself. So whether it be the person thinks, hey, it's just because I'm stopping for 2 minutes, great. But if you think it helps, but it does help to reset. And I'm all about coaching for realistic expectations. If you can do it once a day, just while you're laying in bed, when you're in the bathroom, try it. Come back, and being a behaviorist, come back and give me data, right? How many times did you do this? And I usually teach a SUDS level. How high was your number? How high was your distress before you did it and after? Sometimes that's a little too overwhelming, because usually at the first session, I like them to leave with something. So I usually prescribe one of those 2 tools until we have a little bit of buy-in, confidence. I know that there is something that can help me not feel so up here. And regulated.
Stressed out.
The other 2 interesting things I found that are really powerful little tools with this subpopulation with caregivers are the concept of these psychoenergetic reversals. Again, we teach these in the certification program. I'll be honest, I did a lot of work with Dr. Fred Gallo on these for my book, because I was kind of getting lost in the history and whose reversals and who came up with which ones.
And the language, psychoenergetic versus psychological reversal, and
minis and specifics, and these
Yeah.
started with Dr. Callahan too. So long story short, we came up with, I guess Sandy Radomski was the one who found the safety reversal. And so this is a reversal that I found really resonates with this population. And it's basically saying, I accept myself, even if some of my parts don't feel like it's safe to let go of this problem. Because so often with this population of caregivers, there is a real safety issue. Either the child might be physically at risk for harm, they might have a safety issue, right, that they can't control, or others around them aren't equipped or don't have the skills to be able to safely manage the
Yeah.
child. So it is a very realistic fear. So I find that one pops up a lot. And then we do a lot of work after the fact about delegating and when would you feel safe, who can do what, and all the behavior stuff. And also the possibility reversal, because this is a neurological disorder. And, is it lifelong? Yeah. Can we develop skills? Absolutely. But the idea of, is it possible to ever be over any of the problems that I have that affect me in caregiving for my child, my beliefs, my perceptions, my fears. So those two little reversals I use a lot. And then, of course, I incorporate different meridian strategies, EFT, TFT, and a lot of tapping. But this population of parents, if they're really skilled with behavior intervention, they also like the data.
Yeah,
So
of course.
the homework,
Yeah. It's a
progression of
natural.
yep.
Yeah.
They
So for those who don't know this reversal, I just want to take a moment, if that's okay,
yeah.
and just say a reversal is basically a contradiction. It's saying this is true and the opposite's also true. So even though I want to feel better, I'm also afraid I never will. Or even if I try everything possible and I feel good about it, I'm still worried that nothing's going to work. And so it's kind of like, even if this is true, then the opposite's also true. And how do you hold both realities at the same time and have any kind of a sense of how you're going to move forward? Because it's basically saying, I want to go this way, but I'm feeling pulled this way. So that's what these reversals are. And so the two you talked about, one of them is safety, is I think and I want this to be a safe situation, but in reality, maybe it's not. Or there's aspects of it that aren't, or it won't be safe as much as safe as I'd like it to be, or the possibility that change will happen, but maybe not. And I don't want to have a false sense of hope. I don't want to set myself up for disappointment, but I also don't want to sell myself or my child short and think that possibility can't happen. And so there are some ways through energy psychology to actually blend these reversals or opposites or contrasts to make room for all of it, so that you're not getting in your own way and adding even more stress and difficulty and challenge on top of the contrast that's already there.
Yes, and even there's a permission reversal, which we don't really need to talk about, but just being able to hear those words out loud in the reversal corrections for safety and possible, there's an element of, yes, I can give myself permission to feel both of these ways. And that's just the relief in itself sometimes too.
Yeah.
The cognitive there. Yeah.
What a treat. It's so hard to be in community and in families anyway. And then when you have other things that come in and other people and questions about education and future and finance and relationship and all of this, it's overwhelming. It would be overwhelming as a full-time job that you were being paid for, let alone to have your own issues that come out while you're interacting with your loved ones. And so what a breath of fresh air to read your book, to understand the resources that are available here, and to have some hope and some models for change. So I really applaud you and thank you for doing this important work. And I'm so glad to be part of a partial solution in getting at least this podcast out and hoping that it gets shared amongst those people who really can benefit from it. So I thank you. And as we're coming to the end of our time together, I'm wondering, is there anything else that you'd like to share about maybe helpers, healers, and guides, or intuition, or coming from the heart?
This is a funny intuition story if you want to hear it.
Okay, sure.
It was early on, before I was more familiar with the chakras than I am now. And I was balancing a young man who was diagnosed with ASD, and he was probably 10 at the time, 10 or 11. And as I was balancing and I was, just moving the energy with my hand, and when I went from solar plexus, I went to heart, and he was laying down at the time, and he said, "You missed lung." And I said, "Not sure there is one," but he's like, "You missed the lungs. There's energy there." He's 10. And he wasn't looking this stuff up on the internet. And I came back, I looked it up when I left, and I came back and I said, I owe you an apology. And I said, you were absolutely right. There is a chakra there. He was like, oh, okay. Like, as a matter of fact, but I just think that that's a really neat story. I still remind him to
That's
this day
great.
when that happened. I mean, he's way older now, but
Yeah, well, so you were doing an energy balancing technique off the
yeah.
body of moving your hands in probably a circular direction, and you were focusing above the belly button in the area of what we call maybe the gut or the middle of the torso or something like that. And then you were moving up to the heart, and in doing so, you were, for his reality, you were skipping over the lungs, which are a very vital part, of course. So sometimes people say, oh, what are you doing? This is like a bunch of hooey. And he's like, not only is it good, but you're doing it wrong and you miss a spot. So that's great. That's wonderful. And, how beautiful that he had the sensitivity and self-awareness and the communication skills to be able to share with you what he needed. And then you have the humility to come back and say, you're right. And thank you for helping educate me so that I can better serve you and others. So that's a wonderful little moment. And I think that it speaks to the light versus dark, the light side of having special qualities of awareness, which we haven't really talked about. It could be a whole nother discussion about whether these are actually deficits or strengths. But they are definitely some of the spectrum disorder lists of attributes can be seen as simply different from the mainstream, not necessarily good or bad, but rare. And should there even be a diagnosis? But aside from that, what are these special awarenesses? And there are people who are saying that human consciousness is evolving and changing, and that there's going to be a lot more people who are plugged in to subtle awareness, to multidimensional awareness, to things outside the 3D, and that is not necessarily a disorder. So you're smiling as I say that.
Well, the last thing I will say is I just want to everybody out there to know that if you're an energy worker, I know that it's exciting to want to use these tools with everyone and this population, but please know that, again, neurology is different, individuals are different, and some people, in fact, a lot of the ones that I work with who are diagnosed with ASD have a difficult time in understanding the actual mind-body connection. It's not, it doesn't make sense for them, and they'll do it, but it's just like, yeah, okay, yeah, I guess I feel better, but there's a little bit of a disconnect there.
Yeah.
So as much, I get that question all the time, why don't you use these with others? Because they don't want to do it.
Yeah. There might be other approaches that are not as body-based, that are more conceptual or energy-based,
Yeah,
that are more abstract, and that are more, for lack of a better word, telepathic, that are non-language based, maybe is a better way of saying it, that can connect in a better way. And
it goes
anyway,
back to the confidence and the skill and the neutral.
Yeah.
That's a comfort that provides the comfort.
Yeah. Oh, this has been so fun talking with you, Mandi. Thank you so much for what you're bringing into the world. And I'm just so grateful to spend time with you today.
Me too. That was great. Thank you for all your good input too. Really helpful.
Great. Okay, take care. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for today's podcast. If you want to learn more, you can visit my website for podcast and resources at hopshealingtips.com. You can also like, share, and subscribe to this channel. This podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only and is not providing healthcare advice. Please seek guidance from your professional healthcare team should you need assistance.